We're here today to speak with Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, the chairman of 5F World, GTT Solutions, Honeywell Automation India, and Lighthouse Communities. He's a prolific speaker and a writer of regular columns, as well as 13 books on knowledge management, digital success, and leadership. He'll be speaking with us today about the critical role agency plays when it comes to talking about skill development. Welcome to the Big Idea series, and thank you so much for speaking with us today.
No, thank you, Sanjuktha. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. To get us started, can you tell us about what you think the problems are in the landscape of skill development in India?
Actually, the problem starts earlier than that, because today, as you know, the biggest problem we have in India, which came through in the recent elections also, is there is a huge jobs crisis, because there aren't enough jobs for people. And it stems from the fact that we, for a very long time, had people primarily in agriculture. And unlike China, we did so effectively 30 years ago, we haven't been able to move people into more productive jobs in services and manufacturing. Today, in fact, manufacturing is hardly 12% of the economy, and we need to do much more. And given that, and the nature of jobs coming up in future, we're finding that the education systems in India are pretty archaic, in the sense that they aren't really training enough people for the new jobs that are required. And so that's the first problem. The second problem is that on top of education, skills have not been really provided at the right time, at the right place. I myself was the CEO of Aptech for 10 years, 1991 to 2001. And those were skills in computers which were very much in demand at that point of time. But if you look at it today, the skills that are in demand, let's say for manufacturing, microprocessors or new financial services, are not really being taught in skills institutions. So that's point number two. And point number three is, we almost assume that if we set up a skills institute of whatever kind, I mean, it could be an ITI doing hard skills, or somebody teaching construction skills, or even services skills, that people will automatically come. We don't realize that there is a need for this magic word called agency, which gets people to really want to do that particular skill, and once they do it, to take up a job. So I think that's been the problem. It's a very multi-layered problem, but it boils down to the fact that we must convince young people that they must look for a skill to get a job, and B, once they acquire that skill, they really want to take up the job and do something good with it.
I think in India, the landscape can look quite different in an urban environment or a rural environment. So from your experience, do you find differences?
No, there is. In fact, the other problem in India, as we all know, is excessive urbanization. Because ideally in a country of this size, I mean, we should be having productive jobs in maybe 2,000, 3,000 cities and towns, but it's very kind of clustered or concentrated in a few urban locations. So I think that's one big issue. Because of which, I mean, there are other issues of urbanization, which we won't get into. But the big problem is, and we do a lot of work with the children in urban slums. We're doing that in 7 cities in India. And we are finding that even the jobs that are available in urban India, they are not too comfortable taking it up, because they're not sure whether they will fit into that. Especially somebody growing up in a slum, we're finding that there is so much of kind of discomfort with the external world, having been brought up for maybe 18, 20 years in a very bad environment. So they find it difficult to get the confidence that they can go and compete with, let's say, somebody who's come from a middle class background or a top business school. So I think that's a big issue. The second is the point you just mentioned, which is people in rural India. I mean, the other entity that I'm on the board of is an entity called Educate Girls. We primarily work in tribal areas in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, MP and Bihar. And there you find that, young people are unwilling to even complete their schooling. I mean, because they feel that what's the point? At the end of it, there's no job here. They're not too sure they will survive in the cities, etc. So again, it's a very multifaceted problem. Young people growing up in urban slums are afraid of taking up something. People growing up in villages are afraid of moving to larger areas, and we aren't creating enough jobs in rural India. So I think it's this combination of problems that has to be addressed, and has to be addressed on priority.
Mm-hmm. And you think agency is part of that? Now, agency can be a word that's a bit difficult to pin down. So in the context of skill development, what do you see it meaning exactly?
See, agency exactly means what it says, that can I be an agent of my own transformation? Now, let me give you an example. In fact, it was taken up in very great detail in a novel I wrote, which was my 13th book. And there we actually talked about a boy called Abhay, who's growing up in the slums in Pune. And he grows up, very cloistered, very afraid of the world, etc. And where does he get agency? Because he sees that, look, his family is suffering. he needs to do something. He's probably the only earning member of the family. And that agency came from a deep surge within to say that, look, I must get my family to be better. Now, there are various reasons why people get agency. I mean, people like us growing up in cities, maybe we get agency because we see success stories around us and we want to be like them. Okay, you want to be a Nandan Nilekani, or you want to be a whatever, a Rajiv Bajaj, and you want to get there. So that's the kind of ambition that comes in. But if you grow up with no role models, okay, you grow up with almost no particular motivation. Let's say you're the fourth child in a 6 children family, agency is difficult to come. So what we are finding is that it needs a lot of work. Like in our lighthouses, we run 38 lighthouses around the country. The first 6 weeks is almost always on agency building. So we gamify the process, we ask them questions, let them do peer interaction, and that gives them the feeling that, oh, maybe I can take responsibility for my life and I can do good for myself and for my family. So that is when the concept of agency comes in. And once you have agency within yourself, I mean, you'll always find pathways to success. And that is primarily what we look at, saying it's not the skill that you get into, it's not what somebody asks you to do, but what you want to do and you will aspire to do, that makes a difference. I mean, just to give you anecdotal evidence, if you remember when Prime Minister Modi first became the Prime Minister, they announced the Skills India Mission, the National Skills Development Corporation, all of them great initiatives. But the tragedy was that in the first couple of years, among the hundreds of thousands of people who got skilled in various skills institutes, hardly 12 to 15% actually took up jobs at the end of it. And out of those 12 to 15%, almost 60% dropped out within 3 months. That is the lack of agency. Because you're training somebody, he has a skill, but doesn't really want to take up something. So I think it all starts with agency. Once you create that agency and you enable the power of choice and you give choices. I mean, who are we to say that, look, you, Abhay, must do this kind of program because we think that you should do it. Abhay has to want to do it. And once Abhay has to do it, literally he'll fulfill his name and say, I will be fearless in going out and making this happen. So I think that's the pathway that we're going to create for youth.
So do you see that as coming side by side with skill development, or an intervention that has to be carried out before you get to any skill development? Or how do you see this implementation actually
The second one is absolutely right. It's a precursor. Okay. In fact, right now we are actually doing mass agency. One of the governments asked us, saying it's working well in your skills lighthouses. Can you also make it work for the ITIs and make it work for any other skills agency? So exactly what you said. It's almost like a prerequisite that I must take responsibility for myself, then I will make it happen. So I think it's something that in fact, now we're trying to do it even in schools, because even in schools, we are launching something called the Jeevan Shikshan curriculum, which is nothing but social emotional learning, saying again, can I take responsibility? Maybe at the end of school, I want to be part of Startup India and become an entrepreneur, or I want to do education, or I just want to get a skills. Like if you look at Germany and Switzerland, are classic success stories. They don't force anybody to go to college. I mean, you have a high school diploma, and then you can do work, and then you can come back to, maybe if you want, do higher education. But in India, I think we've got this notion of saying that, look, it's so easy to get a bachelor's degree, even engineering for that matter, that people just go in like cattle and get their education and then find, hey, this is not what I want to do. I mean, I started off getting into a good engineering college for electronics, but 2 years later I realized electronics was not for me, so I switched to mechanical. Fortunately, I had the choice. But some people don't have a choice. They are completely miserable having taken up a job, which is why they drop out. So agency, making a choice, and then deciding what you want to do, and of course having the freedom to pivot. I mean, I've switched 5 careers in my life. Started off in engineering, then moved to consulting, then computer education, software, and now I do investing and a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's always there. But once you have that initial success in your life, it gives you the confidence, and that's the agency personified that will take you through to the rest of your life.
And do you see this coming only from educational institutions like schools or vocational training centers, or are there any other community level interventions that you see happening, or other ways to
I think a lot of, even I do a lot of work with the Rotary clubs. So even Rotary, for instance, is a great instrument of agency. I mean, just to give you an example, my own Rotary club in Pune, I mean, the agency spreads across the 52 members we have. People learn from each other. There's a lot of peer group, aspiration building, etc. Then we work with a lot of communities. We get outstanding speakers to come and speak with us. So almost invisibly, the agency's levels are going up all the time in the lives we touch, in our own lives being touched by senior people. So I think that's something we have to learn from. And as I said, if you, again, it's a question of being very stratified. If you feel that you're part of this community and never be part of the another community, then the agency is not there. But then you kind of restrict your own aspiration or your own ambitions in life to what you want to do. But if you feel the world's your oyster and you can pretty much do whatever you want, that's when you have real agency. So not just in educational institutions. See, there's a lot of criticism of educational institutions today. I myself started with that, saying that, oh, they're not skilling people for the right job, etc. But honestly, if you ask me, a good mechanical engineering curriculum, for instance, should teach engineering disciplines. It's not there to tell you exactly how a pump works. I mean, similarly in IT. I mean, you need to learn software engineering and not, Oracle 11.8 or whatever. So that is the difference between education and skills. So if education is robust, we also have good skilling opportunities, okay, initially by people going to skills institutes or maybe being part of their education curriculum. And eventually, again, having the agency to learn on our own, what we call learning agility, which is as important as the skills, then I think the path is laid out by itself.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about India's education system and how it can maybe contribute to a lack of agency. But do you see this as a uniquely Indian problem or is this universal?
I think it's universal. I mean, in America, what they try and do is because of the community colleges, they're more of providing skills because, as I said earlier, not everybody wants to go in and get a university degree. But apart from that, I mean, if you look at China, for instance, I mean, there's almost as much of a mad rush to get into the few good colleges as there is in India to get into the IITs or good medical institutions. So I think it's a universal problem. The problem is compounded in India because of our huge population. That India, 1.4 billion people, and maybe 200, 300 million people will be looking for jobs in the next few years. That's a huge problem because our job creation is not that good. Our job mobility is not that good. So we really have to worry a little more and saying, how do we get people to want to, as I said, contribute to the economy and make it happen?
So taking into account India's unique characteristics, how does a countrywide intervention look like? I mean, how do we tackle this at that kind of scale?
I'm glad you asked this question because I'm actually in the last 2 months trying to create that model. Just to make it very simple. As I said, in Educate Girls, we do a whole bunch of stuff in tribal areas. So imagine somebody in a tribal village, let's say in Pali, Rajasthan. Okay, he is kind of maybe joined an open school, finished his 10th, and now wants to go beyond and say, look, I have to get out of this village and maybe be a success story. So what we're trying to do is build that pathway, which means that you finished your 10th through an open school. How do you enroll and finish your maybe whatever 12th grade or higher secondary, whichever? And at the end of it, how do you then start getting a skill? And that skill could be in any peri-urban location. For instance, I'm just coming from Udaipur. So on the outskirts of Udaipur, you could have a whole bunch of centers. We ourselves in Educate Girls call them specific centers that are training people for getting a specific skill. And then maybe you could come to an entity like at the Lighthouse, or maybe as you pursue your bachelor's degree, you can also do that. So I think the pathways have to be defined. Because very often, as I said earlier, rural India is rural India, urban India is urban India, and the twain doesn't meet. But if you can make that happen where people can happily migrate from large cities to small towns and be successful there, and from literally the tribal areas of India to peri-urban to urban, I think that would solve the problem to a large extent. But it's a very multidimensional problem, okay, because it needs a certain type of development in the country which is all-inclusive. It needs people to have aspirations which span across communities and class distinctions, etc. And it needs the ability for people to be mobile in terms of, both, I would say, mentally mobile and physically mobile.
Okay. So you work with urban populations, you work with rural populations, and this is something you are trying to tackle on the ground. What are your hopes for the future, or do you see these interventions having an effect? Are you hopeful for how this will play out over the next few years?
I'm very hopeful that, given India's unique position in the world today, because we are the fastest growing economy. I think we will certainly be the third largest economy in the world. But I think if you forget our obsession with GDP and say, the real success story will be GDP per capita, which we're pretty poor. So then there'll be much more of an inclusive growth. So my hope is that when we talk about Viksit Bharat, for instance, Viksit Bharat or a developed India by 2047 is going to happen not because a few people are extremely rich or the recovery and the growth of the economy is what they call a K-shaped economy, but it's going to be by growth across the segments of society. And I keep taking the China example. China is a classic example of people who made that happen. Vietnam is becoming like that. And whenever I go to Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, I'm fascinated by the extent of inclusive growth they're able to do. Now, granted that we are a very, very vocal democracy, we are a very different kind of beast. But even within that, I mean, the real success, the real hope, the real aspiration I have is that Viksit Bharat means development and success for every Indian. And that will be the real joy of being successful in India.
Okay. To kind of bring a close to this discussion, do you want to just tell us, bringing it back down to an individual scale, what would you think a person with total individual agency should look like? What would their choices in life look like?
The choices in life should be almost anything they want to do. Okay, so in the sense that you should have no limitations of a good education or a bad education. Okay, because I myself grew up in a village in Jharkhand. Okay, so in theory, my own agency process, and I talked about it in a TED talk once called, Fantush and the Beanstalk, where I talked about my village friend who's still there in the village, not changed at all. Whereas I could use education as a beanstalk to move out. So I think to answer to your question is everybody should get what I said, a reasonable education, not the best of education, an opportunity to get skilled, and then be able to move up the ladder. And whether then you want to build your career in X sector or Y sector, in this city or in small town, in India or abroad, I think the choices must be open to us. And once that happens, I think young people will be happier and will be more successful. And obviously then India will be more successful. So that's I know it sounds utopian, but that's the dream.
Now, I think that paints a nice picture of what kind of changes you would expect to see within a person and then how that translates to a larger scale. So, any closing thoughts you have for us?
No, not at all. I think there's tremendous work to be done. Okay, and everybody has to participate. And it's not just the NGOs which will do it, or it's not just the government that will do it. It's a kind of very complete transformation that we have to look for. But it begins with our own agency. I mean, if we are happy with what we do in Mumbai or Delhi or Pune or wherever, then that's not going to change. But if we really want to dream a big dream for India and contribute to making that happen, I think then we'll see success.
Okay. Right. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure, Sanjuktha. Thank you.